people would write you reams and reams of their thoughts, their opinions, their comments on your articles, their own insights. It was an amazing dialogue. People would go back and forth between them. There was a forum attached to it that had a ridiculous number of committed users who built an entire online community and an in-person community. I mean, there were football teams that came from that forum. And so it's a really interesting time. I think it was true in other sectors as well. It's true in areas like music, with when bands started really engaging with fans on forums and things like that. That I think is then we would all say that social media has people able to connect more directly now with fans. But I don't think in most cases that, probably because of the scale of it, the dialogue quality of interaction is the same as it was in 2005, 2006.
From Coordinate Sport, it's The Drive Phase, a show about sports founders, leaders and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Our guest on this episode is Adam Fraser, CEO of the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation. Adam became CEO in 2019 in one of the most difficult periods for all charities across the world. Despite that, he has successfully navigated that period to now implement the Global Development Strategy. Adam is a successful sports journalist, holding editorial roles in the leading publications in our sector. Prior to Laureus, he held the role of Executive Director at the groundbreaking Sports Industry Group. During the episode, we discussed the importance of creating the narrative and just what led him to shift his focus from media to the sport for good sector. Enjoy the show. Okay, I'm really delighted today to welcome Adam Fraser to the show. He is the Chief Executive of Laureus Sport for Good Foundation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. Nice to be here.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming on, and obviously we're navigating the time difference with you being based in New York and the Eastern time to the UK. So yeah, thanks so much for giving the time. As with all the shows, we try and get to know you a little bit better and share a little bit of background information on you before we get into your career and what you're up to. So if we were going to go back to your childhood, how would you describe that growing up with a sporting context in mind?
I had a happy childhood. Not going to go
too deep straight away. Yes.
With a sporting context, I always loved sport. I grew up in Cumbria, so the Yorkshire Dales and Lake District, right where they meet. And so it's exactly as you would expect. It's kind of very rural, small towns, small villages.
You kind of kicked out the back door and just said, go and play. And
sport was kind of what we did. Like, that was what you did with your friends. Football more than anything, but everything, cricket, tennis. I think we were just very, very, when you look back on it now, it's almost feels like something from a book or something, to this world where you were just out all day playing sport. Sure, my memory of it is like a little bit rose tinted and there were other things, but I think that's generally what we did. It's what we did after school. It's what we did at lunchtime. It's what we did at weekends. It's what we did in holidays.
Yeah, for sure. I
never played anything to a very high standard, but I played it all with a lot of enthusiasm.
No, it's interesting you say that, because I was thinking about it in terms of, in my mind, I'd be playing football for like 4 or 5 hours after school, till it gets dark. And then now I'm thinking, would I ever, I've got 2 young kids, I'm thinking, would I just let them go outside and play for like 3 or 4 hours in the street? But times have changed for sure. How about family life in terms of siblings and family? Were they a kind of a close family? Key driver around sport or education for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my family, everyone's very sporty. Like, I come from what they say, a blended family of steps and full and halves and things like that in terms of siblings. But everyone's always been very kind of physically active. My mum and dad were both very physically active. I mean, my mum's well into her 70s now, and she's still rock climbing and kayaking and I think sculling, actually, not kayaking, but she's still doing all sorts of things. So no, definitely a physically active family. And I think not with any kind of passionate mindset of like, we must do this, but just because it was enjoyable. And that is something that from kind of a professional perspective now in the work we do as Laureus, we always bear in mind and get into very technical things about how you design programs for kids. But the most important thing is that they have fun, because that's what keeps them coming back. That's what keeps them engaged. If kids show up and don't enjoy what they're doing, then ultimately it's going to be fruitless.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like kind of building it as that lifestyle choice rather than something that needs to be tick boxed. So for you, were you always really lofty position now in terms of where you sit now and running the Global Foundation? But was that always in your mind to be working in sport and sport administration or high level? What was the kind of thought process going into like leaving school and then starting university or working?
But I think like a lot of people at university, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I loved writing and I knew I loved sport. So put those things together, and that's why I went into sports journalism. The opportunity came up at the right time. I was at university in Leeds, which is a great city. I loved being there. And Football 365, which was a website that I read and was a big fan of, had an opening there for a junior writer, and I went for that. And that was the start of my career in sport. I think over the years, that chance of kind of being a journalist really teaches you a huge amount of things, both time, but also things that are relevant to the rest of your career. And now, coming on a couple of decades later, I haven't left the world of sport, but I still feel like I've experienced a huge amount of things in it. Sport's fascinating because it's kind of, the sport industry is this conglomeration of events and sponsorships and media and social impacts and all these different things. And I feel very lucky that through working in sport, I've been able to be involved in a lot of those different areas.
Yeah, I mean, intrigued about the position in Football 365 and just in terms of the day-to-day. So at that time, what were you covering? Were you reporting on matches and kind of giving the match reports and stuff, or were you writing the opinion pieces, etc.? How did it stack up?
It was primarily running the site itself. How it worked then was match reports were coming from press association, etc., from journalists who were out there. But it was the editing of those, the actual what the front page of the site looks like, how you were going to get people involved and engaged, what were the interesting talking points, the feature pieces and opinion pieces, as you say. I always think this is a personal preference of what you look for in journalism, but I always think that's the side of sport that interests me, is getting into the thinking around it and some more of the analysis than just the pure match report of this thing happened. And I say that with like the greatest respect for the journalists who go and write those match reports, because some of them, absolute poetry. They're beautiful pieces of writing, and people are absolutely reliant on them. It's such an amazing tradition, the level of coverage the game gets.
I can't remember his name, it's escaping me, but I remember as a kid, my mum used to always have it on the radio, and I can't remember who the guy is, who used to come in and give you like a really eloquent match report from somewhere. I remember it sounded like...
I think radio journalism is its own amazing thing. I think the quality of people reporting on sport on radio, it always amazes me, to the way that they can really convey things that you just can't see it. You're entirely reliant on their description, but sometimes you can feel like you're there if it's done well.
Sure. And with Football 365, so that was, you started there, as like I said, as a junior. What happened? Was that quite recently, quite soon after you started the acquisition with Sky Sports?
Yeah, it was actually. And it's been through different phases of ownership over the years. Certainly, I've been there only a few months, and it was acquired by Sky Sports. So it was a really interesting experience, kind of working for a very small editorial team on a very focused, bespoke site platform, but then being part of the Sky Sports machine. And that was probably my first exposure to a wider world of journalism. And I was very lucky, writing about sport. I got to write for a bunch of different publications, for kind of official magazines, for FA match programs. I did so many different sorts of writing, and then sort of transitioned into writing more and more about the business side of sport, which is then what really took me on my career path. But again, just that exposure to a wide breadth of topics, places, again, all within sport, but I think was really formative in my career.
I think obviously you plugged into the big machine of Sky Sports at the time. I'm thinking back, potentially if Football 365 was what it was then now, the opportunities and the ways to be independent, well, with a big following and readership and audience is, I guess, night and day from where it was back then, right?
I think the interesting thing then was we were operating in a world that was pretty much before social media. So I actually feel like our relationship with our readers was closer. I think people would normally say the opposite. They would be, and Football 365 still does run a mailbox, but people would write you reams and reams of their thoughts, their opinions, their comments on your articles, their own insights. It was an amazing dialogue that people would go back and forth between them. There was a forum attached to it that had a ridiculous number of committed users who built an entire online community and an in-person community. There were football teams that came from that forum. And so it's a really interesting time. And I think it was true in other sectors as well. It was true in areas like music, with when bands started really engaging with fans on forums and things like that. That I think is then we would all say that social media has people able to connect more directly now with fans. But I don't think in most cases that, probably because of the scale of it, the dialogue quality of interaction is the same as it was in 2005, 2006.
It's probably, I guess, assume it's more positive as well. If you like, it feels like the comments and the feedback was more well thought out versus a kind of a like or a dislike or an emoji.
Yeah, it was definitely thought out. I mean, it could certainly be negative. It's football. If you say something, you say pretty much anything, you're polarizing opinion, and so you would have a lot of people telling you didn't know what you were talking about. But it was thought out. It wasn't just click a button for an emoji's response. And that's not to say emojis themselves are this fascinating language. There are studies into it, like how incredible a communication tool they are. So I don't want to sound dismissive of them, but certainly, yeah, we would get very, very thought out interactions.
So moving on from there, you mentioned the business of sport and moving into writing more about that. How did that kind of manifest itself away from the role there at 365?
Well, so at the time that I was at Football 365, we were starting to cover more European football. We had very much a UK focus, probably. We had a guy called Sheridan Bird, who then really built out our Italian coverage at the time. And then the La Liga, the Spanish side started to come up. And I had the opportunity to go to France and do some work for Football 365 and some work on other things. While I was in France for a year or so, I guess, I started to get really interested in the business side of sport there. And there were things happening like France hosting the Rugby World Cup. There were things like referees strikes or threats of strikes in the French Football League. And I just got very interested in like, what's the machine behind this all? Like, how is this actually happening? So then an opportunity came up to write for a startup magazine called Sports Pro, which is still now beyond a publication. It's a whole range of platforms, events, etc. But at the time, it was just a startup magazine. It didn't have a website. I mean, we talk about how the world's changed. One of the things I was tasked to do when I came in was the website, because I had that experience of online journalism, get a newsletter together to start reaching out to people. And it was an amazing place to work because it was very much focused on the business of sport. And the founder of it said, people like people and people like numbers. And even though he didn't stay around actually too long with how the ownership changed to the magazine, those two things do stick with me. People like reading about people and people like knowing the numbers. And that was really what we did. We had very in-depth conversations with leaders in the field, CEOs of teams, heads of sponsorship agencies, that people representing the biggest sponsors in sport. And we really got into their business strategies and why they were doing things and how they approached things, what their approach to leadership was. So for a few years there, it was just constant learning and a real freedom to be able to follow the interesting stories. And that's the amazing thing about magazine journalism is you get a few pages to play with. You can go quite in depth on things. And that long form journalism isn't necessarily the same in some of the formats we see now. But then it was fascinating. And I just feel like I learned so much from the people we were talking to, the people we'd be interviewing.
I guess with it being a startup as well, you're probably exposed to more than you would normally if you joined a more established or corporate type of organization. You're in
I think the first most places in my career, I suppose, certainly in the earlier years of it, they weren't necessarily all startups, but they all had very much a startup mentality. So you were involved in everything, exactly as you say. And I think that's a really valuable thing, to be exposed to lots of parts of the business. You get amazing specialists in a particular field who've always been focused on, I'm an account executive in PR, and then an account manager, and then a senior account manager and a director, etc. And they follow that path. And they're incredible expert in what they do. When I'm running a business, having had that exposure throughout my career to so many different areas of it is I think really, really valuable.
Curious in the steps from there to obviously Sport for Good and what that journey, obviously looking at the business side, and I suppose that exposed you to how we cooperate and maybe what impact the sport was making commercially. How did you move from there up to where you are now? The kind of the stops in between.
Well, so even then as a journalist, I was fascinated by the sport for development field and how people were using sport for social change. I remember writing for Sports Pro about Skateistan when they were a startup using skateboarding to help girls with education in Afghanistan, or Peace and Sport, the conference, and different initiatives around covering different ways that teams and leagues were using sport to impact their communities for the better. And that was always absolutely fascinating to me. I took a kind of, I guess, a traditional move from journalism into the communication side of things. I went to work for an agency called Benchmark, who owned the Sport Industry Awards, which at the time was in the UK and South Africa, the Bloomberg Square Mile Relay, which had started in London but was expanding, which is a participation event. There was a talent management arm. There was Beyond Sport, which was growing into a significant organization in the sport for development space. And again, really just the group as a whole had a real startup mentality and was working across a whole range of things. I went in there as communications lead for the whole group and also as executive director of the sport industry group. But actually, I went in there in the communications role and then took on the executive director of the sport industry group. It wasn't in the original plan in the job interview. But it was a really great mix of being able to get experience kind of building brands and telling stories from the other side of things, from that communication side, as well as the actual business operations and need to make money, raise revenue in that sport industry group role. But the things that resonated for me were the stories of how sport was driving social change. And it was funny at the time, things have shifted. At the time, as a comms person trying to get people to write about sport for development, at times it was like banging your head on a brick wall. Lots of people were like, no, our readers aren't interested in this. Fans aren't interested in what their club are doing in the community. They're interested in what happens on the field. And I always thought that was short-sighted. And I think now it's very, very different. Like you see the amount of coverage this field gets. You still hear people say, oh, people aren't as interested in the community side of things. But like, frankly, I think they're wrong about that. Those are the stories that I think really do get people hooked in on a personal level.
Just to touch on sports industry groups, obviously hugely influential now, but at the time when you joined Benchmark, was it a case of, were you starting that up and starting to kind of scale it based on like you had done at Sports Pro? So were you starting up the newsletter and doing that, or were you kind of jumping?
No, I would love to take the credit for that. But actually, at the time, it was already a really established, successful property. The Sport Industry Awards was already getting 1,500 people into a room for a big celebration. The sites and newsletters and things were still up. We had a whole range of events like going through the year to engage people working in the industry. As I said, there'd already been kind of an expansion to South Africa, so it was a chance to scale and grow that in the early stages. But the kind of the flagship UK property there was really well established. I'd like to think that I definitely helped it to grow and helped it move on and develop as a business. We took on BT Sport as the first title sponsor of the awards and different things like that. But no, it was definitely established. I think the building things was much more on the areas where the business was really expanding on some of those other areas like Beyond Sport, Square Mile Relay, even though they still, as I say, the whole agency, the whole organization had very much a startup feel. And so people were involved in every part of the business. I suspect now that another decade or so on and more established, people are in probably more distinct teams because of the scale of the business. But at that time, it was still that same mentality of everyone was involved in everything to some extent.
Yeah, and you just on the sports industry again, you mentioned the obviously attendance of the events and the awards. What was the readership like? What does it look like now? Because obviously it is niche, but it's kind of widespread in terms of interest on sport and business. It's more and more, seems like there's more and more interest in that. So that the newsletter, and probably most of our listeners subscribe and get that newsletter week on week. But I'm curious, and maybe it's different now, but curious in terms of the readership of that.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you now, and I don't think I could necessarily remember numbers or anything accurate then, but the readership was, and this was the same at Sports Pro, the readership was very much people working in the industry, people working in the business of sport. The stories were coming from that group. It was a real platform, I think, for the industry to kind of share interesting things with each other, if that makes sense. And I used to be staggered and just amazed by some of the people who would be reading things we were doing. I always remember getting calls or emails from people like Scott O'Neill, who was running Madison Square Garden and went on to the Philadelphia 76ers, or Paul Barber, who is now the CEO of Brighton, but then he was at Tottenham and he went to the Vancouver Whitecaps. And as a relatively young journalist, let's say in the Sports Pro days, it's amazing to get messages from them saying, hey, I love what you're doing. Can we talk? I'd love to tell you about this thing. And I think Same with sport industry. There's some really smart people working in the sports industry, and it's cool to be in a place that's telling the stories of what they're doing.
Definitely. I mean, coming out of that, and you've obviously highlighted the storytelling potential, the impact that sport can make, but obviously communicating that wider. I'm assuming that's what kind of hooked you into the current role, and what was the journey to Laureus from there?
Coming to Laureus, it was really just the chance to make a difference. I know that sounds a little bit cliche, but I'd really seen how sport was changing young people's lives, and the chance to work on that full time was just really exciting. I actually came in to head up our fundraising and partnerships. As you say, the storytelling is such a key part of that, like building that connection between the work and the people who are funding it, whether they're a brand or another charity or a government entity or wherever it is. Like that story of here's how sport's driving change in the community has been really key to unlocking funding for this space. So I had a few years of leading that fundraising.
Looking at it from the outside, looking at Laureus and think, well, look at the ambassadors you have, the A-class, top of the top, most profile, high-profile sports. We'd think maybe that would make it easy for fundraising. Right? Is that the case, or is it very much down to that telling the story, explaining the impact, etc.?
Oh, look, the athletes who support Laureus are absolutely core to what we do, and not just as kind of ambassadors, not just as names we can put, but they're some of them are just very deeply involved in what we do. They sit on our boards. They're part of our decision-making process. We have a huge athlete voice in what we do as an organization. In many ways, we're an athlete-led organization because we're about their desire to give back. And they've had I think many of them would say they've had incredible opportunity through sport, and they want to share that with others. I don't think fundraising is easy anywhere. It's always hard to unlock money and to build partnerships. And it's also, that's what makes it enjoyable. That's what makes it fun when you do succeed. And so we've had success as an organization, and we've grown, and we've been able to have more of an impact. And absolutely the athletes have been a key part of that. But what it fundamentally comes down to for me is the quality of the work on the ground. Because once you look under the hood, you really need to make sure the programs you support are having an impact in young people's lives. And that's even more important when you've got high-profile athletes involved or high-profile partners, because if they're putting their name to it and then the work is not of a good enough standard, that would be a risk to them and a risk to us. So really the success of our fundraising comes down to the fact that we're fundraising for genuinely good and impactful work in the community.
And it's, probably a good time to maybe talk about the model, Laureus. Well, I know stats-wise, huge impact, and there's like 6.5 million children impacted by your programs, and it's over 50 countries and territories you're working in. What's the model in terms of how it all plans out?
I think last year, 2021, it was exactly 50 countries and territories. And I'm always very wary of that. Like, I never want to have that as like it was 50 last year, so if it's 51 this year, that means success. Because our KPI and success is not like how many countries can we be in, what are we doing? It's about actual tangible impact in young people's lives. But you're right, over 22 years, Laureus has impacted the lives of more than 6.5 million young people, as you say, in 50 countries and territories, supporting hundreds and hundreds of programs around the world, which range from boxing to get kids out of gangs in Rio de Janeiro, to surfing to work with young people's mental health in Cape Town, to basketball in Brooklyn to get kids into college. It's a huge range of programs doing amazing work. And the model is we exist as an intermediary funder, a grant maker. We go and raise money so that we can support those community programs in doing their work, connect them to funding they wouldn't otherwise be able to access, tell their story to raise the profile of this sector, and to really be its champions and be the people who can unlock funding that helps organizations move from A to B and from B to C, whether that's that they're scaling and reaching more young people, or they're doing things in more locations, or they're just able to develop and become more sustainable as organizations.
Like you mentioned, the high-profile athletes and partners, etc. Is it a case that they would come to you? Obviously, you're out fundraising, but is there a case? Does it ever happen where they would come to you and say, "Like, I really want to make an impact in my country," or this is a challenge that's happening that's affecting me or people that I know, and can we build a program around that or a fund around that? Is that something that happens?
Yeah. It does. It really happens in different ways. I mean, the thing people always forget about athletes, I think, is that they're individuals. They're saying, here people talk about, like, here's our strategy to engage athletes, or here's what athletes think about this thing. And I'm like, it doesn't make any more sense than being like, here's what teachers think about this thing, or here's how you engage doctors in what you're doing. They are all individuals. They all have their own reasons for being involved. They all have their own issues they care about more deeply than others, and that they really personally connect to. We're very lucky that actually a huge number of them support every aspect of what we do, and our work is across education, employability, peace building, gender equity, inclusion, health and well-being, and they support them as a whole. But they definitely connect more with some individual parts, or in some cases with the country that they're from, or the place that they're from. As a high-profile example, we work with Naomi Osaka around her philanthropic work, and so we manage that in Tokyo, LA, and Haiti, because they're places she has a personal connection to. Now, her dad's from Haiti, her mum's from Japan, she's living in LA, and so there's a very personal connection. I also think she's committed to changing girls' lives all around the world. And so I think that you have sometimes a starting point of a very personal connection with something, but the majority of athletes that I'm lucky enough to encounter are generally very good people who want to use their platform to make a difference and do that for good cause that might not have the immediate personal relevance, because it's something they care about and believe in.
Definitely, it always feels like you accelerate their goals. So a lot of athletes or individuals have their own kind of foundations and want to make an impact. But if they were to partner with you, you've got the reach and the scale to maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so. Look, athletes a lot of the time might come to me and say, I'm thinking of starting my own foundation. What advice do you have? And my advice would always be like, think very carefully about starting your own foundation, because it's a big commitment. It's a lot of work. It's a reputational risk if you don't do it well. It's not something you can do for a year and then decide, I wish I hadn't started that, and shut it down. It's a big commitment. So I think we work with athletes in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes that's advising them on their foundation or partnering with their foundation on something. The Rafa Nadal Foundation do incredible work in Spain. We're like really happy to work with them on some of that. Sometimes it's more like I said with Naomi, where they don't start their own foundation, but we build something together. Sometimes they say, actually, Laureus is the cause I believe in, and this is what I'll put my name to, and be a champion across all of that work. And that's someone like Sean Fitzpatrick, who's our chair, the former All Blacks captain. Sean, as far as I know, has never launched his own foundation, but he's as committed to Laureus as anyone could be to someone who starts their own foundation. He's a huge part of our work and very deeply involved. I guess it's about helping athletes find the way in which it makes sense for them to want to give back and to have an impact in young people's lives.
Probably a good time when we're talking about starting foundations. It's probably a good time to just chat about how Laureus, like what's the origin story of Laureus? How did it come about initially? Maybe before your time, but when was it founded? And well documented that, Sean Fitzpatrick and that's like really well known Olympians and stuff involved. But how did it come to be?
Yeah, so it was before my time. So I'm always wary of kind of trying to tell the story and it be my own construct or my own imagining of the times. But Laureus was founded in 2000. It was a very simple premise. Like, can we bring together the world's greatest athletes to celebrate the best things happening in sport to make a difference in the community? So the Laureus World Sports Awards were launched that year, and we've held them ever since, and they celebrate the World Sportsman of the Year, Sportswoman of the Year, Team of the Year, Athlete with a Disability, Action Sports, a whole range of different awards of the absolute best in class. People judging that, the only people that Laureus has ever felt can judge the greatest athletes are the greatest athletes of all time. So our academy that was founded was of the greatest retired athletes of all time, and I think still represents that group. Connected to all of that was the launch of the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation alongside it. So Nelson Mandela famously at the first Laureus World Sports Awards, it gave his famous speech, "Sport has the power to change the world," and that's been the founding belief of our foundation from that day. So we kind of started in that first year doing what we do now. We made grants to organizations around the world who we saw using sport to change young people's lives. Probably over 22 years, we've We've got more sophisticated at different parts of it, whether it's the impact measurement, the sustainability, the capacity building side of things. But the kind of core purpose of Laureus doing that work was set from day one and has continued to develop and guide our vision and mission.
And I guess you talk about vision and mission. What's the future hold? So let's say if we're looking at 3 to 5 years out, you talked about metric not being around just another country, another program. Is there something that you kind of working towards over that medium term?
I mean, there are a huge amount of things internally at Laureus, like different initiatives we're involved in, and that's always developed. This year, for the first time, we launched Sport for Peace and Humanitarian Action Fund after how we'd seen people from our programs displaced in Afghanistan or affected by the hurricanes in New Orleans or the natural disasters in Haiti. And of course, all brought together really in the conflict in Ukraine. Andriy Shevchenko is one of our ambassadors, and he's someone we worked very closely with on establishing this fund to make sure that we were able to work with refugees from that conflict. And sadly, there are always new things happening in the world, and new negative things happening, and we're always trying to position ourselves best to tackle those. But on a kind of more positive and proactive basis, I think a big thing we've been doing is getting outside of the bubble of sport for development and really getting plugged into other sectors, other organizations where sport can make a difference. So a couple of weeks ago, during the UN General Assembly in New York, we hosted a roundtable at Concordia that had former heads of state. It had the senior people in sport from UN Women, UNHCR. It had the legacy, people responsible for legacy from the 2022 and 2026 World Cups. It had the International Olympic Committee. It had brands and businesses, just a huge range of people outside of a pure sport for development bubble, because we just believe that building that collaboration between them is how you can actually really drive change in communities around the world.
So given that, do you ever get involved at like a policy level? Get involved at a policy level to influence anything in terms of, given the profile of your partners and just even that event you discussed, is there capacity for that?
You can stray into very kind of technical definitions of what's advocacy with a small a or a big A, and what's lobbying and what's these things. I think we are always real champions of the power of sport to make a difference, and we have success in unlocking government funding for that. So in London, we operate our model we call Sport for Good Cities, or Model City, which is a whole network, a coalition of organizations that collaborate and work together to drive social change. And the Mayor of London's office, the GLA, is a major funder of that and has been since its inception. In the Netherlands, we have a big focus on reducing youth crime. And the Dutch government is actually the major funder of that program, because they believe that sport has the ability to stop recidivism or keep kids out of trouble, keep them from offending in the first place. And in Illinois this year, we, for the first time, have secured money from the state government of Illinois, because the coalition that we built in Chicago, which is amazing. The organizations we're supporting are working with something like 20% of the youth in the city, and they've collaborated and they've unlocked millions of dollars from the state government to support that work. So on that side of things, I think that's where there's still a huge amount of growth a huge amount of opportunity in terms of growing government investment in this space. And you've seen it shift. You've seen governments sort of at times talk less about winning medals and more about actual change in the community and increasing inclusion in sport, increasing access and opportunity from people who've previously been excluded from it. And certainly we'd always champion and really support that and use our voice where we can.
So what would you say the day-to-day in your role as chief exec, what are the day-to-day challenges, the recurring ones that just keep coming up and you always tend to be dealing with? I guess what are they and how do you deal with them?
The big thing for us is there's always more we could do. That's the frustrating part of it, is for all the kids you help, for all the programs you can support, the millions of dollars that we're giving out in grants every year. You wish you could do more. There are always great programs that you don't have the budget to support. There are always initiatives where you wish you could find a way to achieve something. So I think the big challenge is sometimes focusing on the positives and the incredible work that's been happening, which is so exciting to be part of, because we've got a team of people who do this work because they want to make the world a better place. So anytime they're not able to do that is deeply frustrating to them and deeply frustrating to me. I think in the charity space as a whole, The other big challenge you have is whatever you raise, however much money you raise, you don't really get to invest that in your business because your charitable purpose is the actual work in the community, right? So I just spoke about raising millions of dollars in Illinois. That money will go out as grants. It will support great work. It will be incredible, but it's not money that I can then be like, right, here's how I'll use that to grow our business over the next 5 years in this place because we exist to get that money out to the community. And so that's always, I think, a challenge versus a for-profit business where you could, in some circumstances, take that to just be continually team or investing in it, whereas we're always guided by that charitable purpose.
Definitely. I know there's a few different approaches on how to manage that. Is it, I would say, charity water? Is it where they split the funds that are coming in and they've, let's say, a headline sponsor who covers the running costs of the charity, and then you've kind of got that 100% pledge. It's all going back out, the donations for the cause. But it's got to be a tough one. For yourself, with all of your experience and with all the organisations you've worked with, do you have any kind of approaches to leading the team, especially when you're kind of global and you've got teams, different satellite offices and stuff like that? What's the things that you always kind of focus on to lead?
But the big thing for me is I think there's been a fundamental shift in what leadership looks like. I think I was very lucky with the leaders I had earlier in my career. There's lots of ways they're role models for me, but not really in how they led a team, because I think now you have to be so much more inclusive and collaborative in your decision making. It's not really the case that I sit there at the top of the org chart and make sweeping declarations about how we should do things. I think leadership now is much more about finding the right way to empower your team to do good things. Obviously, you've got to hire good people and help them develop, but then trust them to know the work and know the right answers, and you're almost providing the platform for them to do that. And I think that's the big thing. And tied to that is therefore not having an ego about it. I'm never trying to take credit for work that someone in my team has done, because we get organizational credit from the amazing people we have working, from the effect they're having in the community. And I think that leadership now is about empowering your team and about being successful together rather than trying to be the shining star.
Yeah, definitely. That ego is the difficult one, especially an organisation, and you're judged by the performance of the empower everyone. Really makes sense. What would you say? I've got two more questions for you. I know we're tight on time. In terms of reflecting like we were there, if you were going to look back and with all the experience you have now, give yourself some advice when you're starting out the journey, would you kind of go back and tell you if it's just one nugget of information for you?
I say this to people in my organization and elsewhere now is don't worry about what comes next. People can often spend their time thinking like, well, what am I going to do after this? What am I going to do? What's my plan for progression? How am I going to end up in such and such a role? And I'm a big believer that the journey is more important than the destination. Like, this is what I'm doing. This is what I should be focused on and what I should enjoy. And I think that that's true for anyone at different stages of their career. Like, if you focus on doing that work well and enjoying it, you will, and obviously find something you enjoy doing, I think you'll be much more fulfilled on an immediate basis rather than thinking, oh, I hope in 20 years I get to this point or I get to this role. And I think that almost mindfulness about how we work. I mentioned Scott O'Neill before, former CEO of Madison Square Garden and the Sixers. His book is called Be Where Your Feet Are. And it's very much about that mentality of being present, focus on what you're doing. I'm a huge believer in that. It's a great piece of advice for anyone in this space.
I love that one. Do you find it difficult, obviously, as a creative, like coming from that journalism background, now being in leadership, do you have, it's just me being curious, do you have the outlet that you would have had before when you were writing? Do you feel that maybe, my final questions around kind of habits and things you do to stay on top of form and reduce stress, etc. So I'm thinking of yourself, you might be writing. Do you have that opportunity in your working life, or is it something you have to kind of consciously seek out and do in your spare time?
No, I do. I mean, I think actually as you end up in a role like mine, and today in this conversation, good example, like you have the chance, people want to ask you about what you're doing as an organization. And so whether that's speaking or writing, you have the chance to go and tell those stories. Probably had to learn to talk about myself a bit more, because in journalism you don't do that, and then in this you end up having conversations where people are like, oh, how do you feel about this? But I think there's still
be
that,
careful not to use third person as well then.
Exactly.
Adam feels
I think there's still that chance to be creative. I think being creative in what we do and what I'm able to do in my role is a big part of why I enjoy it so much.
Really appreciate you giving it your time today. It's been great. Thanks for being so transparent. Just want to say, yeah, big thank you. And we'll get everything you mentioned, loads of kind of highlights and references there. So we'll try and link it all into the show notes for anyone listening.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this week's show. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at dryphase.podcast@coordinate.cloud, tweet us at Coordinate Sport, or follow us on Instagram at coordinate_sports, or on my account at James_Ventures. This episode was produced by Nancy Kwamboka, with support from Claire Goodchild and Lola Small, with special thanks to Rochelle. I'm James Moore, and you've been listening to The Drive Phase from Coordinate Sport.